Hi, I'm Niels. As Matthijs said, I was the writer of a game called Rive. And I'll talk today about the game's history, about some of the big ideas behind it, including, of course, the idea of having an optional storyline. Finally, I want to talk about some of the story structure in the game. But first, so that we all know what we're talking about, let's take a look at the trailer.
Welcome aboard, sir.
Go away, robot.
Will you please be gentle to the ship?
I don't see why. Rive is available now on PlayStation 4 and Steam.
Feeling disoriented?
You messed with the warp station, didn't you?
Of course. I control everything here. Don't try to escape again, because you can't.
We'll see about that.
All right, that's Rive. Now for a minute, I'd like to go back in time. 16 years ago, I was trying to be a games journalist. I made a website called GameSen, which was a Dutch website about video games. And I have this very vivid memory of having my first actual interview with real game makers. It was a small startup, two guys, a company called Two Tribes. They were making Toki Tori on the Game Boy Color. And actually, what's funny is that they told me later that they were really nervous about having their very first interview with a real games journalist. And of course, it turned out to be a great conversation. We stayed friends, and I eventually worked for them as a freelancer. Look at how young they were. And look at them now. Sorry. One of the things I remember from that interview is that they said they were going to make Toki Tori, their puzzle game, very quickly. And that they really wanted to make a shooter in the vein of Parodius. If you're not familiar with Parodius, it was this early 90s shoot 'em up made by Konami that actually was a parody of a lot of other Konami games. But as a lot of Two Tribes projects would tend to, Toki Tori took a lot longer to make, and it actually set them on this path of making puzzle games. They got quite well known for their puzzle games. And they didn't make that Parodius style game. Although in 2005, there was a moment when this idea of a shooter came back. It was a concept for a Nintendo DS game that they were making for Namco, I think, for a bit. It would have touchscreen aiming on one screen and looking at this on-rails style first-person shooter on the other screen. Some concept art was made. I was actually involved, sort of trying to think about something cool to do with the story. But it didn't go anywhere. Namco sort of shut off the deal. And Toki Tori and Two Tribes kept making puzzle games. That is, until Toki Tori 2 in 2013, which I think was Two Tribes' best game until that point. A very underappreciated gem, although of course I'm biased because I helped with the story. But the game didn't do well enough, and Two Tribes had to downsize quite radically. They went from more than 10 people to just 3. And at that point, they basically said, well, let's use this legacy, slow puzzle game engine to make the super fast shooter that we always wanted to make. So this is some of the first concept art. It was going to be a sci-fi shooter, of course. And it really continued on from this Nintendo DS concept. You can still see some of the sort of glowing circuitry board patterns still in this art. Except, of course, it was a 2D game. It was still called Rewind, Like in the DS game, there would be a time machine that would rewind the same areas many times over again, and there would be more and more energy and more enemies. So it would get more difficult over time. And of course, a lot of this changed during almost 3 years of development, but some things stayed the same. So this was the time machine, and this is what the warp machine now looks like. So it's basically the same thing, although it moves you not through time, but through space. This is the earliest footage I found of the game. This is June 2014, and I think it's sort of funny how slow it is, even though a lot of concepts are still the same in the game. It's not sort of hypnotically slow compared to the game as it is right now. Oh, there comes a lava wave. So one of the first discussions that I was involved in was about the tone of the game. What were we going to do about that? And even though the company was just 3 people, there was a very heavy split. There was a lot of discussion. Some people wanted to make a serious shooter. Others wanted to make something more silly and over the top, like Parodius. And I guess the third guy was sort of in the middle. And what we came up with then was to have a serious and grounded science fiction world, but with characters that would be a little bit crazy, with dialogue that would be outrageous and funny. Basically, the dialogue between those two would be a playground in which we could do everything that was over the top that we wanted to do. We also thought that perhaps these characters would know about video games. Because if one of the characters would actually build the levels and the enemies and the challenges, that would explain why some of the levels looked like those games of our youth, the games that we grew up with. So this level obviously references games like R-Type and Gradius. This was one of the big ideas that we had, one of the main sort of philosophies that we started with. We all have wonderful memories of the games we grew up with, like Gradius. If you think back to them, oh, they were amazing. But if you actually go back to play them, it's a bit of a downer. You can appreciate them through a sort of, I don't know, museum-like fascination. But if you actually play them and compare them to games today, the controls are sluggish, explosions are this big, they were so difficult, they actually make you cry. Games made you cry back in the early 80s. And what we wanted to do was make something that feels, that is sort of more like the memories of those games than the actual games. For the story, I thought a lot about the original Half-Life and how it would never pause the game to show you a cutscene, to show you how the story would progress. I wanted to have something like that, but in 2D. And I also wanted to have something subtle, something that would fit the game almost naturally, that wouldn't feel sort of tacked on like a different thing. I wanted it to be of one piece, even if it meant that it would sort of be simple, I guess. So this is how we came up with Roughshot, the main character. A scavenger flying through space, looking for loot, with a soft spot for dental hygiene. He has a toothbrush in his mouth for the entire game. And basically he'd just be trying to figure out what was going on, much like a gamer would approach the game. And he'd be doing all this from the comfort of his spider tank that can walk and shoot and jump, but also fly and swim, although the dealership never mentioned that he can't fire underwater. And we imagined that it would be quite cramped inside this spider tank. It would be so cramped that it would be so boring to sit there for long flights between jobs. This sort of illustrates our sense of humor as well, I think. And our idea was that Roughshot would play the games of our youth on the same screen inside the spider tank that he would see the actual game on. It would be extrapolated, like some cars extrapolate a top-down view using side cameras, the same way Roughshot would use extrapolation of his camera views to sort of show what you're looking at in the game. So he sees the same that we do. And of course, this is something that's quite hard to convey within the game, but we try some small things that give you this sense that he's actually seeing the same thing that we are. So Roughshot stumbles onto Galaxian Service Vessel number 6, which is the most boring starship ever, a factory ship that's even the shape is boring. However, there's a computer, of course, a rebelling computer. That was one of the early ideas. And And for a long time, we weren't quite sure how this would work. My first idea was that we'd lock the player in a room once in a while, and then the computer would talk to him through security cameras or something. But that was quite boring and went against our idea of not interrupting the gameplay. I mean, you would still be able to move within the room, but that was sort of cheating. So we turned the rooms into corridors, where the camera sort of became a drone that would follow you around. And of course, it was still the computer talking through the drone. And ultimately, the camera became the computer. So there was no computer in the ship anymore. It was just this drone. We called him Daryl Lloyd Lancaster, also known as DLL. He's the ship's passive-aggressive robot butler, who's really the mastermind designer behind everything on the ship. And he's trying really hard to keep you, the player, or you, Roughshot, on the ship because he's bored. And the idea quickly became that Roughshot was like a gamer or a games journalist, so I could write autobiographically. Jaded with everything, I'd already seen all these games. They couldn't really get me excited anymore. And of course, DLL would be like a game designer, really proud of everything he made. And of course, the two would clash. But then maybe they could become friends at the end. Wasn't sure yet at this point, but there was this idea that it might turn into a kind of buddy story. And what was fun is that we had press builds going out of the game as far back as 1.5 years ago. So people would be playing the game, commenting on them. So there were actually actual gamers reacting to the game. And we used a lot of their responses to the game in the writing. They really helped us shape the personality. I'm going to show you a YouTuber called L Chest Breach. And well, you'll hear a few of the things he says.
Oh, yay. So now we can hack those medical bots to help us. Hey, I need robot kisses. Give me some robot kisses. Come on over here. Oh, that aura of robot love. Are you gonna follow me? Why don't you come with me? Come with me. What's your name, Cindy? Come on, Cindy. We're gonna have a magical robot romance. Oh, Cindy, you're following me. I love you.
Yeah, so we thought this was a really fun way to approach the robots in the game, basically, to sort of anthropomorphize them a little bit more, which we did a lot in the final game. So another idea that we had was, let's make the story optional. Basically, we thought that, especially when playing action games, there's a big group that is just not interested in a game, in a story. So we thought hard about how to include something interesting for the people that were interested and something that would be easy to ignore for those who weren't. Well, how did we do this? One of the simple things was giving mission logs after the missions. Of course, things like this is what a lot of games do. Some texts are just optional, you don't have to read them, but if you want, you can dive into them. But we wanted to have dialogue that was integrated into the game as well, thinking back to Half-Life, but in 2D. 2 years ago, this was the first implementation. It was just pop-ups on the screen, but the action actually continued behind it in slow motion, which was a bit weird, didn't really work, wasn't what I was looking for. It's funny to see the old version of Roughshot as well. He already had his toothbrush, but he was a little bit more badass, I guess. So this was a few months later. We put the text on the bottom left, so the computer's text could be on the bottom right, sort of going against each other. Text was typed in real time, and you could actually just play at normal speed during these conversations. But the problem was people just weren't seeing it. They weren't even noticing. We learned a lot about how to have sort of more easygoing bits of gameplay when there was text, but still it didn't work enough, which is how we ended up with this idea of putting the text in game space next to the characters. And this kind of worked, but all this time we were still thinking it was going to be all text. We had never seriously considered doing a voiceover. But then our audio studio, Sonic Picnic, came by with this test by a voice actor named Mark Dodson, and we were just sold when we heard it. He was Roughshot. He really brought him to life, and as soon as we heard it, we couldn't go back. We had to do the voiceover. And of course, it helped that Mark voiced some of our favorite movies ever. And what's funny is that he actually voices both Roughshod and DLL, which nobody notices, but it's true and is really awesome. And this kind of fixed our problem with the text next to the characters and them being voiced. Everybody now notices the story, so that worked. But of course, we wanted to do something more. We had this idea of doing an optional storyline, and we wanted to have that in the dialogue as well. And basically, this is what we did.
Hello, Gravity, my old friend.
Welcome aboard, sir.
A drone? This starship should be long dead. Is it running on auxiliary power?
Please enjoy the sights and sounds.
Good riddance.
As I was saying,
Go away, robot.
all right, I'll just open the door. Until next time, angry man.
So yeah, now the optional story is totally in-universe, totally in character, and also an opportunity for comedy. So here we had our optional storyline. If you see the messenger and you're not interested in his story, just shoot him. Sorry, robot. But the main character is not sorry. So finally, I said I wanted to discuss story structure. This is the last part of my talk. There's 33 minutes of voiceover in the game, which may sound like a lot for a 6-hour game, but more than half of it is narration by the main character, and just 10 to 15 minutes is dialogue, which is pretty economic if you compare it to a movie. We really had to think about what we wanted to convey. When we were sort of planning for the game, we were going to have DLL talking a lot about all his beautiful products in this Apple, Johnny Ive kind of way. And he would go on and on about the ship's history, this beautiful history where so much was going on there in what is now a derelict ship. There was going to be a lot of back and forth between the two, but in the end, those became just a few instances, just a few unique situations. I think game design often starts as creating routines, like general programmatic solutions. So DLL would come by all the time, you'd always shoot him, he'd always come back. But ultimately, this is not how it works, I think. Because when you're making a story-like experience, a single-player game, it's not about routines at all. It's about unique situations. So this is what the game looks like from a top-down view. As you can see, there's not a DLL doesn't even appear that often. There's a build-up to it. It's always changing. No encounter with him is the same. In level 2, he doesn't even appear. He doesn't come back that often when you kill him. That's marked with the red X's. Sometimes you can't even shoot him. We give him a shield then, so we're sort of cheating, sort of backing away from our optional storyline. Sometimes we do need to tell you something. And by the way, you get an achievement if you never kill him. If you can sort of restrain your urge. Story structure. I already said we try to keep it subtle as a logical extension of the levels and gameplay. So this is what it looks like at a high level. The first act is sort of exploratory. You're looking around on this ship, trying to figure out what's going on. And then the first act break comes right around here, where Roughshod figures out that this is really not a good place and he has to get out. He decides that he doesn't like this DLL guy and he has to escape. So the second act is all about trying to escape and finding out ultimately that it's not possible to escape this ship. So there's a lot of back and forth there. And then at the second act break, well, he decides that this is not going to work. But luckily at the same time, DLL realizes that because of Roughshod's doing, the ship is falling apart, everything is exploding, this is not a good place to be. And he has to get out now too. And so the third act is about the buddy story, about them coming together, becoming more friendly, and actually breaking out, but the two of them working together nicely. It's interesting that a bunch of reviewers, a bunch of critics have commented that there is no plot to speak of in Rive. And honestly, reading reviews is so interesting. I honestly wonder what they mean with this statement. What I just showed you, I think, is not a convoluted and complex plot, but it is a plot. It's almost the very definition of a plot, I think. But I've been thinking, maybe they just skipped this optional story of ours. Maybe we just did a really good job. So, I don't know. So yeah, one more thing. Let's get a sip of water first. So about half a year ago, Two Tribes announced that they're closing down, actually. That they're done with this saturated marketplace, all those games coming out, working for years on something so uncertain, so sort of going against those graphs we just saw at the previous speaker, where everybody was always going to work in the games industry. Two Tribes has decided that they are done. They don't want to do this anymore. They don't feel like trying new business models. They hate them. They feel like they're dinosaurs that don't understand what's going on around them. So they're not starting a new project. Rive is their last game, although they'll support it in the end. They'll do everything to get it just right, to fix all the bugs. And I actually kind of like this, I think. It's not often that a studio closes in such a controlled way, where the founders are just really behind it. And I also really like that I knew this so long ago, and that it was able to find its way into the game. So more than ever, Roughshot became that jaded gamer that we just can't seem to grasp. Why is he not liking our games? Why doesn't he see a story where there obviously is a story? And more than ever, DLL became us, the designers, trying desperately to create something worthwhile, something meaningful, that would finally truly please the audience. And in a way, and this is sort of not frontmost in the game, but in a way it became a cry for help. Because in the end, I think gamers and game designers are not that different. We're all looking for something meaningful to fill our boring lives. We all do it for the love of these games that help us do that. But ultimately, of course, we may find that in the friendships we make along the way. So yeah, all of this and more is in the game, which is out now on PlayStation 4 and Steam. So thank you. Thank you for your attention. Oh, and I do want to mention, I said I liked it, but I actually hate that Two Tribes is quitting, because I loved making games with them. So I guess that means that I'm looking for new people to make awesome games with. Thank you.
Questions or offers for Niels?
Offers, right now, please, yeah.
So you were responsible for writing all of the dialogue and the plot, and you were in control of all of that.
Yeah, basically it started from the very beginning, sort of thinking about the concept and the setting, the characters, the missions and the levels, down to actually writing the lines and also implementing them in the game. So I built it all into the game's logic, which made me very in control, which was nice.
We have to wrap up here to give everybody the opportunity to switch rooms for now. One more applause for Niels.